Welcome to this webinar. Before we begin the presentation, I want to provide you with a few housekeeping items. On your screen, you will see a taskbar with icons. Each icon is assigned to a particular element of today's webinar. After the webinar is over, please take our survey to tell us how we've done. Throughout the presentation, you can network with others or submit questions to the speakers in the box next to the slides. Download resources from the folder icon. Today's event is being recorded and archived and will be available within 24 hours. For on-demand questions or comments, send us an email by clicking Email Us. If you experience any technical issues today, please refresh your browser by hitting F5 for a PC or Command-R for Macs, or email webinars@bmpmedia.com for one-on-one support. And now I'm excited to turn it over to today's moderator.
Good afternoon, and welcome to this webinar, Change Ahead, Trends to Watch in 2018. This event is brought to you by Security Magazine, and it is sponsored by Pivot 3. I'm your moderator. I'm Diane Ritchie, editor of Security Magazine, and I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Today's presenters are Brandon Reich and Bill Hackenberger. Brandon Reich is the surveillance business leader at Pivot 3. In this role, he leads all product and go-to-market strategy for Pivot 3's global video surveillance portfolio. Bill Hackenberger is the Vice President of Data Security at HITRUST. He brings 25 plus years of executive and management experience building and leading engineering and business teams in security companies, large and small. Don't forget to submit your questions because later on in the program, both presenters will address as many questions as possible. Today's event is being recorded and archived on securitymagazine.com, so you can share the presentation later with your colleagues. And now I'm excited to turn it over to today's presenters, Brandon and Bill.
Okay, thank you, Diane. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Brandon Reich. We're going to talk today about a couple of things. We're going to go over what are the big trends that we're seeing today in the video surveillance as well as the broader physical security industry and some of the things that you need to be aware of. And then we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into two of those trends. So I'll talk quickly about one of those trends and what are the implications are to you, what some of your options are out there available to help address that. And then I'm very excited to be joined by our guest speaker today, Bill Hackenberger of HITRUST, who will help us understand the issue of data security in and around video surveillance, what it is, what does it mean to you, what options do you have, etc. So let's go ahead and get started. If I were to poll the overall security industry on what are the big major disruptive trends happening in the world today, you'll find a number of them, a number of different responses, but I think you'll quickly find some commonalities here. You're going to start to see things like the emergence of the cloud now into the video surveillance and the physical security space. You're going to see the rise of artificial intelligence and machine learning technologies, which will help us, I think, finally bring the promise of video analytics really through to reality. Now, Pivot 3 has developed partnerships with industry leaders across all of these areas, but today, we're really going to focus on the first two that you see on the screen here. First, we're going to look at really the deluge of new data being generated by video surveillance and how we can accommodate all of that new data, how we can really deal with that. And then secondly, we're going to look at the question of how we protect the integrity of all that data. Now, we all know we've seen lots of very high-profile incidents in recent times, things like the Mirai botnet, even the access, remote access, unauthorized access of the video systems around the presidential inauguration recently, some general foreign exploitation of vulnerable video surveillance equipment and technologies. And there was even recently a report released by the Trump administration about how some of these technologies that have been deployed all over the world have a number of vulnerabilities in them. So let's start today with the question around big data. Now, as many of us who have been around the security industry know, video is really often considered the original Internet of Things or IoT application. It's also known as the largest IoT application in the world. In fact, by far the largest, and I'll demonstrate that for you here in just a minute. But video technology is really continuing to evolve. We're seeing more sophisticated capabilities come out, advancements in our cameras and the surrounding technologies around video surveillance. We're seeing new use cases for that video. Surveillance technology is not necessarily relegated these days to just catching the bad guy as it always has been in the past. We're using it for more and more things. And as a result of all of this, we're seeing security technologies move out of the closet more and more into the data center. And what that means is that we're seeing new expectations from our IT departments, things around server virtualization, system management, resiliency of our systems, and how do we leverage new emerging capabilities like the cloud and other things out there within our physical security technologies as well. Now, I told you I would demonstrate that video surveillance is one of the largest IoT applications in the world. On the left-hand side of the screen now, you see the forecast number of cameras that will be IP cameras that will be shipped globally, put out by IHS recently. And you see in last year in 2017, almost 76 million cameras were shipped, and going forward to next year in 2019, we expect that number to go over 100 million new cameras shipped. And that's a staggering amount of new cameras being shipped for what is a relatively mature industry. But remember, it's not just the number of new cameras that are being shipped, it's also that these cameras are shifting to higher and higher resolutions. And what that translates to is the chart on the right-hand side of the screen. This was a study done by Wikibon last year, and it determined of all of the big data applications in the world that video surveillance will generate in 2018 more than 24 zettabytes of new data in 2018. Put that into perspective, that's almost twice as much as the second largest application in the world. And what's more, that the rate of new data generation is growing at about 42% per year over the next couple of years. So we foresee a huge challenge coming in how we capture all that data, how we store it, and how we protect it going forward. Now, oftentimes when I talk to IT people about video surveillance and these subjects, we spend a little bit of time educating about the fact that video surveillance is not like the other applications or the other workloads that you run in your data center. And as a result, we have to think differently about the implications that this has back on your server and your storage and your network infrastructure. Particularly, we look at things around performance, resiliency, and scalability. So I want to talk for a second about what those are and why they're important. First of all, performance. When I say performance, what I mean is the storage system's ability to capture all of that data that's being generated without any kind of loss. Now, video is a very write-intensive application, and big data spikes are a very common occurrence. This combination can quickly overwhelm a traditional storage system's ability to ingest or to capture all of that data without loss. This leads to something that we call frame loss, which has the impact of degrading the quality of the image or potentially even leading to loss of entire segments of video, which ultimately reduces the effectiveness of our video surveillance systems. Secondly is resiliency. Resiliency is very, very important in our video systems going forward. Believe it or not, hardware used in video surveillance technology is actually 3 times more likely to fail than when it's used for non-video technologies. And most of our conventional methods that IT departments use for protecting systems against downtime and data loss either don't work for video, or they can be very prohibitively expensive in a video surveillance environment. And lastly, we talk about scalability and how important this is. One thing I always say is that video surveillance systems never seem to get smaller, And in many cases, they almost always seem to get bigger. And there's lots of different reasons. It could be we're adding new cameras, we're upgrading to new technologies. It could be that our environments are changing, our budgets are changing. There's lots of different reasons why video systems get larger. But a common misperception out there is that as my video system grows, I simply have to scale storage capacity to keep up. And that's not true. In most cases, you actually need to scale your storage, your compute, even your bandwidth capacity, typically linearly. In almost all ways, it has to be done seamlessly without disrupting the operation of your existing systems. Now, before I tell you how we solve all of these problems for you, let me take a quick look at what your options are for video storage infrastructure today. The most common architecture that people are probably the most familiar with, something called a network video recorder, or an NVR. Many deployments these days still use this. The IT world would refer to this as direct attached storage. It's very low cost commodity servers combined with a video management software and typically sold as an appliance to the market. This architecture is really fairly antiquated. It works okay for smaller systems out there, but as your systems get larger, there's some real drawbacks to this type of architecture out there. Some real challenges with retention times, single points of failure, very difficult to manage these systems at any level of scale. Now, I assume that you're probably not considering this type of architecture for your video environment. If you are, please talk to me first and we can go through in a little more depth some of the challenges that you might be concerned about there. On the other end of the spectrum, the IT world has really standardized on this enterprise storage architecture where we separate the servers and the compute platform and they all work together with a shared storage medium like a SAN or a NAS type device. Now this can solve a lot of the challenges that direct attached storage offers for larger systems, but they introduce a whole bunch of additional problems as well. First and foremost, they were never designed for a video surveillance application, and as a result, they tend to perform very poorly, which leads to some of those problems with image quality and video loss that I talked about before. But maybe more importantly, there tend to be very expensive systems built on proprietary hardware that are very complex to manage over time. So the existing architectures that we have available to us today really leave a lot to be desired and don't do a great job in solving some of our largest challenges that we have with video surveillance. For just a moment, let me shift gears and talk about what's happening, a major trend that's happening in the world of IT and how this now applies back to us in the physical security world. Like most functions, IT organizations are looking and have been for many years looking for ways to reduce their overall costs and complexity. And as a result, they've taken a very hard look at their data centers. And what they found is that these data centers are actually massive cost centers for them. So a few of the larger technology companies that you would recognize, some of the big major innovators out there, companies like Amazon, Google, and Facebook, have come up with ways to eliminate a lot of the proprietary and expensive hardware that most data centers are comprised of and vastly reduce the cost and complexity of their data centers by building their own infrastructure using low-cost commodity hardware and some very specialized, sophisticated software. This trend is called the software-defined data center, probably a term that you may have heard of a bit. Now, this is great for Amazon, Facebook, and Google, but most companies don't really have the ability to do this, to create their own data center architectures on their own. So they look to industry for solutions that have similar features and benefits of reducing costs and reducing complexity. And that has led to a new category of technology called hyperconverged infrastructure. Now, the reason I bring up this term is that Pivot 3 has taken this concept of hyperconverged infrastructure and developed a platform specifically built and optimized for a video surveillance environment. So what does that mean? Well, if we look at this slide, if we look at the image on the left-hand side of the screen, what you'll see is that we really take the best of both worlds. We start with low-cost commodity server hardware. In fact, in many cases, the same hardware that you see deployed with NVRs and NVR technology. And we put them into groups, or what we call clusters, and then we use some very specialized software that turns these clusters of servers into enterprise-class infrastructure. The first piece of software we use is server virtualization. That enables us to consolidate all of our various video management software, could be multiple video management softwares, access control, video analytics, PSIM, or whatever other types of software and applications we have out there, allows us to consolidate that and typically deploy on much less hardware than would typically be required. And then we have our software, which is called vStack. vStack stands for Virtual Storage and Compute, and it does a couple of things for us. First of all, vStack actually aggregates all of the storage and the compute and the bandwidth resources from all of the servers in a cluster, aggregates them together into one common pool that we call a virtual SAN. This virtual SAN then becomes available and accessible by every single server in that cluster, every single VM in that cluster. In the world of video, that means every single camera has access to the entire virtual SAN, regardless of which physical machine it's associated with. Now, secondly, vStack actually becomes the brains of the system. It serves in a controller function, which means it controls how data moves from the application level down to the physical hardware layer. And that's one of the ways that we're able to optimize this solution specifically for a video surveillance workload. Now, without getting too deeply technical, on the right-hand side of the screen, you see what some of the high-level benefits are of our solution. First of all, we will deliver the highest levels of availability and resiliency, up to 6 nines of availability. And what that means is we will eliminate system downtime and data loss. We will ensure that your systems are always online, that you're always recording, and that you always have access to both live and recorded video, even in the event of significant hardware failures. Secondly, we will sustain and achieve the highest levels of video ingest performance, meaning we will eliminate that problem of frame loss that leads to image quality degradation and video loss. And we will sustain that performance again, even during major hardware failures. And lastly, we are highly scalable. By simply adding another server or another node into a cluster, you scale not only your storage capacity, but your storage, compute, and your bandwidth capacity to the entire cluster in a very simple and a non-disruptive manner. So scaling this system over time is very, very simple. Now, the great thing about this is that we deliver all of this enterprise class capability and functionality without the cost and complexity typically associated with enterprise class infrastructure. We've designed the cost and complexity out of our solutions. Now, the last thing I'll mention here, a question that I often get is, your technology sounds great, but who do you integrate with? In the video world, integration is one of the things that we're very, very concerned about. And what I'll tell you is we are a completely 100% open solution. We demonstrate that by the fact that we have deployed this technology in thousands and thousands of organizations in over 55 countries now around the world. And we've done so with virtually every major video surveillance and security technology out there. Now, if you happen to find one that we haven't deployed with somewhere, let us know. We can bring it into our labs, we can get it tested and validated, and we can demonstrate to you that it will work. Now, I'd be happy to explain this in more detail about how we can help you solve your video surveillance and your big data challenges. But for now, I'd like to move on to the main event here. So I'm going to turn it over to Bill Hackenberger, and he's going to talk to us about some of the things we need to be considering around data security in our environments. So Bill, over to you.
Thanks, Brandon. Just by way of introduction, again, my name is Bill Hackenberger. I'm the VP of Data Security at HITRUST. HITRUST has been around for about 12 years, and we're very much involved in security and compliance, so things like data privacy regulations, as they service, large enterprise, banks, government, U.S. intelligence community, etc. And as Brandon pointed out, one of the things that we see is that video data is becoming arguably the dominant set of data that is now being created on an ongoing basis. So it's become this huge, huge issue with respect to security and compliance. So I'd like to I'll go through quite a bit of material fairly quickly, but I'd really like to give people a flavor of what the implications are, especially what the implications are relative to different compliance regimes where either the government or commercial entities or whatever are obligated to be taking certain measures to protect that video data. So I always also like this cartoon because I thought that it's emblematic of a lot what's happening right now. Everybody's heard enough in the news about where if once data gets out there, it's being used in kind of unexpected ways. But before I get started on that, I'd like to explain a little bit about encryption, because encryption will be a focus here that we'll be talking about. And some people obviously will know this well, but for those that don't, I want to have a little bit of a primer here. So essentially, encryption is a process by which you create what's called an encryption key. An encryption key really is just a randomized string of bits. It's a very, very long number, and it's highly random. And in fact, how random it is will determine how strong the encryption result is. And the idea is that you create an encryption key, and you have to do that in a very special way, and then you run it through an algorithm that is, these are industry standard algorithms. They have been highly tested. They have all kinds of mathematical rigor behind them. And the whole idea is that they take the original file, the original data, the video image, and they randomize it in such a way that if I have that key, I can essentially unrandomize it and return back to the original very, very quickly. But if I don't have that key and I wanted to try to decrypt it, it would take me literally, in some cases, hundreds to thousands of years of processing power. So it's a very special mathematical process where I can encrypt quickly if I have the key, I can decrypt quickly if I have the key, but without that key, I can't do anything else. Now, a central point of that is being able to protect those keys and manage those keys, make sure they're created appropriately, they're sufficiently random, which is a whole another process, make sure that they're distributed and handled in a highly protected way. So they're a little bit, key management is a little different than a lot of typical applications. And so why do we do this? We encrypt for a couple of primary reasons. Number one is security. That is, I want to make sure that those video files are appropriately protected when they're sitting inside my infrastructure. When they're sitting inside that SAN that Brandon was talking about, we want to make sure that it's sitting in there in a protected form, that someone couldn't get a hold of it, someone couldn't get a hold of a backup image of it or something, and be able to gain access. So security is obviously a first piece. The other is integrity. That is, if someone were to come along and imagine that they did have one of these images and they tried to change it. Well, we want to know that if you change an encrypted file, essentially, then any attempt to decrypt it will not result in the original file. It will be all jumbled up. It won't work, basically. And that's important for making sure that the file hasn't been tampered with, and that we can, and in some cases, what they would call chain of evidence. And that's to make sure that, hey, this file was in this form when it was originally received, and at a much later date, especially in legal proceedings, that when we look at that file again, we can be sure that it hasn't been tampered with. So integrity is an important thing that crypto helps us do. And finally, privacy, and that's the idea that says encryption keys should only be made available to those people that are authorized and have a right to see that data. So think of it as encryption keys as a way to us to provide access control over who gets to see that data, who doesn't, etc. And then finally, decommissioning. And that becomes really important in the kinds of environments we're talking about here, because we do have all of these images. There are backups of those images. There are multiple instances of that data so that the system can be highly available, so that there's a failure on one side that it's available elsewhere and so on. And so the idea is that I want to know that I can, when the time is appropriate, and I want to erase that file, and we'll see that certain regulations sometimes require us to do so, that when I want to erase that file, I want to know that that is being decommissioned everywhere, that there isn't some extra copy sitting out there that somebody could get a hold of. And we do that by actually destroying a particular encryption key, which means that that file, that encrypted file, is never decryptable. And so I know that there's no way that anyone can access that data. So those are the general benefits of encryption. I'll talk a little bit about now, start to shift over to, well, why are we doing this, and sort of who's compelling us to be concerned about this. I won't spend a lot of time here. Essentially, we've all heard of all of the various breaches that have happened in recent times, right? Obviously, Equifax was a huge breach. Yahoo, where they originally, thought it was several hundred million, turned into, in fact, 3 billion Yahoo accounts that were exposed, Uber, and so on. So I won't go into those, but needless to say that even though those breaches didn't necessarily involve video data, these are big companies with a lot of capability and so on, and yet they're being breached. And what it also points out to you is that a lot of data that is being stolen or accessed or mishandled is unencrypted data. And so we want to take a tact where where by default we're going to encrypt this data and protect it, and we want to apply that in the video world. And so one of the questions would be, well, are there breaches that are happening with video data? And the answer is yes, and you don't need to look very far. Actually, I did this where I basically Googled leaked CCTV footage, and you come up with over 100,000 videos that have been leaked. Now, how did people get hold of these videos? Who gave them access to them? Why did they have the authority to give away that access, etc.? So we really want to start to incorporate some protections over that data so that the people running the video systems always have control. It's very automatic, it's very simple, and they don't end up suddenly appearing in Google when they don't want to. So I'll shift over a little bit to talk about regulation. So what we've seen is that there's a lot of regulations out there, and there's a growing body of regulations that have been focused on protecting data. And normally people think of that as, in the U.S., it would be Social Security numbers, or it might be people's addresses, their email addresses, et cetera, other information, their financial information, their healthcare information. In reality, there's been a whole body of data privacy regulations, data security regulations, data security standards that have been out there. And we see some of them, and increasingly, they encompass video data. And even though in a lot of cases people are not looking at protecting video data in that way yet, it's really now happening. So I went back, I looked at some scenarios, and you can actually see way back in the case of in the UK, the Data Protection Act of 1998, and then the Protection of Freedoms Act in 2012. And basically they are now, again, these regimes are changing, so they're now specifically calling out that you need to protect video data. So here they're talking about surveillance camera systems, that it's closed circuit TVs, that it's any system recording visual images, et cetera, and any systems that, or any systems, the hosts, the systems that are actually running a surveillance camera system. So you'll see that the regulations are beginning now to encompass surveillance systems, and that has a lot of legal and financial and other implications for what we want to do going forward. The other, when you look inside the U.S., what you'll find is that there's a myriad of different data privacy and other regulations. Now, in the U.S., a lot of them are very focused on a particular kind of use case. So I looked at a number of those and see how do they relate to video. So in this case, for instance, there's a thing called CJIS. It's the Criminal Justice Information Services. It's a document that defines what they would call CJI, Criminal Justice Information. And it's very much relevant today, and we've certainly seen lots of these videos where you have things like body-worn cameras from police or surveillance videos off of buildings and so on. So, and they look at very specific kinds of information that they want to protect. So things like if on that video you can see a crime being committed, or you see, or there's images of crime victims because it's a privacy issue, or minors, and so on, even to the point where it will be things like if there was a video that captured the, someone with a screen or had in their hand somebody's driver's license. All of those things essentially represent personal information at some level as it relates to criminal justice. And so if you look at the body of the CJIS requirements, they state that any criminal justice information that's stored electronically, which is what we're talking about, needs to be protected and should be encrypted unless it's in a specific, protected zone. And in order to encrypt it, you need to have control of cryptographic keys and so on. So what they're describing there is the same kinds of encryption mechanisms that we use in very large data centers within the government and banks and so on. So we're really seeing a lot of overlap with the kind of work that we've done in the past for business kind of data. Another spec within the U.S. and more broadly is called HIPAA. It's a electronic protected health information. So this is any patient information. You probably have gone to a doctor or something, and you fill out a form, and you'll see a mention of HIPAA. What that is basically saying that any information related to health that can identify an individual needs to be treated in a particular way. And that means that in that example, so this could be surveillance, that could be the presence of people within offices. It's also other things like images, videos of treatments, all kinds of things, is to, number one, you need to implement a mechanism to encrypt that data. And interestingly, you can also, they also have a model that says if you do, in fact, encrypt that data, and imagine you encrypted that data and it was stored somewhere and there was a breach, meaning some hacker or some event happened, or maybe you just misplaced the data. But if that data was encrypted, then they're saying then you have safe harbor from notification. What that means is that I don't have to, this is now not a crisis, because they're confident that that data, that even if that data was lost somehow, because that data was encrypted and can't be accessed in any other way, it doesn't result in a breach and all of the legal and financial and other cataclysms that are a result of that. So there's a lot of sort of good practice, as well as just helping mitigate against the risk and legal risks and so on if you do keep this data encrypted. If I go to one that actually encompasses a lot of organizations, again, this one is in the U.S. This is called, there's NIST, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They have a publication, it's called Special Publication 800-171. What that is that the government, federal government, will declare all different kinds of data as being in a category they call Controlled Unclassified Information. And in fact, you can go online and you'll see there's a thing called the CUI registry. And the CUI registry is a big listing of different types of data that the government considers, it may not be classified, it's unclassified, but they consider it controlled. So the reason that that's important is if I was a university that was doing, say, research work for the government, or I was a commercial entity, or an organization that is in any way handling, doing contracts on behalf of, et cetera, or getting money from the federal government, then I'm obligated to protect that data in my systems, even though it's essentially federal data that is nonetheless in my systems. They're stipulating that you protect that data in an appropriate way. Or if you don't, then you run into problems. And in fact, there's a lot of universities, for instance, that care very much about this because they could lose that. They could lose their funding because the government could take away their contracts and so on. And so you see, just this is a small sample of the kinds of data we're talking about. So any video information related to Department of Homeland Security, so a lot of surveillance stuff. Any surveillance information that has to do with transportation, that's out of the Department of Transportation. Any law enforcement information, any geospatial information, and so on and so forth. So there's lots and lots of categories like this. And very importantly, anything that you would consider personally identifiable information. So any scenario where a person has the subject essentially has a reasonable expectation of privacy. If that's true, then it falls into this category. And so if you look at, if you're that kind of organization, you look at that 800-171 specifically says you need to protect the confidentiality of that data at rest, and you need to do that with what they would call FIPS-validated cryptography, which is the kinds of crypto that we work with. So you can see that even though these might sound like kind of obscure regulations, they actually encompass a very large swath of the kinds of data that we're handling. And as Brandon pointed out, when you see this enormous rise in video, not just for surveillance, but all kinds of purposes, that increasingly, whatever that data is, it is being captured essentially by these different regulations. So then I'm going to talk actually about one that is really a big deal. And that's a thing called GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation that is being put in place by the EU. It goes into effect this May 25th, and it has global impact. And what that is it says, again, any information that is either directly or indirectly can be used to identify a person, a citizen or resident of an EU country falls into this category. And it has all kinds of legal and security implications. So this is a very, very big deal, and right now you'll see a lot of large organizations are very much scrambling to get their hands around this. And what I was really looking at is saying, how does video fall into this group, essentially? And it does. So what we'll see is that the design of systems that are going to be handling data, video data, by default within the GDPR requirements have to, by design, meaning just as Brandon has said, that we're building systems that right from the get-go, as that data is being captured, we want to be able to protect it and encrypt it. We need to do that by design, and it needs to be the default case. You don't want to protect the data as an exception. You want to protect the data by design and by default. So that's an important concept in their model. So systems that do this, they would consider valid for the regulations. The other thing is that they've really put a lot of teeth behind the and implications behind the standard. So for instance, if you didn't do this, and if there was a case brought, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but if there was a case that was brought that says you're not protecting the data in this way, they actually have the ability to fine up to 4% of global revenue for a company. That's an enormous, enormous number. That's the largest number that has ever popped up in any regulation that we've seen to date. So it's really got a lot of people's attention. And so obviously we very much want to make sure that we don't run afoul of this. Now, one of the other stipulations is that if you do have a breach, if there is a problem or you suspect that data was lost or stolen, then you only have 72 hours to basically notify the authorities. That's a very, very short period of time. So what that tells you is you really need to have the mechanisms in place that give you a solid understanding of where everything is, how controlled everything is, so that you know exactly where to go, what the implications are, what data we're talking about, et cetera, because you only have 72 hours to do this. A lot of people are so the kinds of configurations that Brandon was talking about with the SAN and so on, is very important to have a very highly organized system to be able to do that in that short a period of time. Now, the good news is that by virtue of the fact that you're encrypting that data, then that means that if you do get such a problem, just like that earlier regulation I was talking about, they have what they call safe harbor, which is saying that if the data is encrypted, then it's okay. Then you don't have to go through this notification and this whole process. So it's increasingly important to say the legal and financial implications are too big. I have to be very clear to make sure that whatever this data is, I want to make sure it's protected, and I want to have my bases covered. So even in the event of something that, where someone somehow got a hold of images, data, I want to make sure that data is encrypted and they can't decrypt it, and so I'm protected. And then lastly, I'll mention about GDPR is they have some notions. One is called data minimization and storage minimization. And what those are is, what they really mean is, number one, only collect the data you need to collect. Don't collect more data than you don't, because in the past, people have collected data and then thought, well, maybe at some point in the future I'll use this data for other reasons. You want to be able to have a very clear path. Now, the good news in the video, and certainly in the video surveillance case, is that that's very clear. We're collecting this data for surveillance reasons, for certain kinds of coverage and protection. So we want to collect the data for that purpose and that purpose only. And then the other is, only keep the data for as long as you need it. Be able to roll that data, be able to essentially decommission that data at another point. And again, this is where encryption becomes really important. Because if, again, by design and default, if we're encrypting that data from the very beginning, we know that in whatever environment we may be in, maybe it's every month, maybe it's every 2 weeks, maybe it's every 3 years, that we want to decommission that data, because just keeping data around but and potentially represent a problem for you later is not a good idea. We want to know that by shredding that encryption key, by destroying that encryption key, we know that all images, all backup images of it, everything else can't be decrypted. And so it's a very efficient and thorough way to make sure that I'm properly decommissioning data and I'm following good, essentially, data hygiene. So that was a lot, very quickly, a very quick run through of a lot of the data privacy regimes and so on. But hopefully that gives you a flavor of it. The way that we do this, and again, HITRUST has been around for a while. More recently, we've been doing some work with Pivot 3 to really look at this whole area of security and compliance as it relates to video. And so the model that we're working with is that we've taken a encryption and key management system. It's a highly automated encryption and key management system. It's called data control. It actually has two elements. One is called key control. The other is called data control. And how that works is that key control is a fully contained, fully capable key management solution. Key management, again, can be very complicated. So what we've done is we've sort of taken all of the complexity of that out. So it will automatically generate all keys, distribute all keys to all the elements within the systems that are needed. It'll automatically do things like, without going into the details, things like key rotation and all of these other techniques that you need to be doing in such a way that it's sort of happening under the covers. It's automatic. No human being ever has to see a key, handle a key, deal with a key. That's really important. And it's highly available. So that means that it spans across multiple pieces of hardware. If one piece of hardware fails, it's still reliable, et cetera, et cetera. That's one piece. That's the key management piece. The other piece is what we call the policy agent of data control. And what it is within, for instance, in the Pivot 3 systems, they're essentially spinning up these virtual machines, these virtual instances that are capturing all of this video data and doing so very, very quickly. And what the policy agent is doing is, as that data is being captured, it's automatically encrypting it. And it's doing so that as that data transits all the other elements of the system on its way to the underlying storage, all of that is already encrypted. So it's a very secure model for being able to do that. Now, one of the things that's most important, especially in the video capture side, is that it has to do this at speed. It's got to do this really, really fast. And so HITRUST, again, we've been around for about 12 years. We're, as a company, we're part owned by VMware, Cisco, and Intel. And so we do a lot of work with Intel as part owner of the company. And part of that work is taking advantage of things that are built within the Intel chips themselves. And there's a capability that's called AES-NI. It means AES, it's essentially what they would call new instructions. It's an expansion of the crypto functions, but it is doing it in the chip itself. And what that means is all of this encryption that we're doing is not happening in reality. It's not happening in software. It's actually calling down to a special portion of the chip in order to perform the encryption operations at hardware speeds. And that's what gives us the ability to actually perform all of this encryption and do it so fast that we don't get into the dropouts and frame loss and everything else that Brandon was talking about. So it used to be that encryption was a high-cost exercise. Most of it was done in software, et cetera. But with the advent of things like AES-NI and the kind of work that we've done with Intel, we have the advantage of being able to do this all at full speed, full capture. So from the practical reality is you don't see any loss. Everything's happening at full speed, and it's all automatic. So the if there's interest in being able to understand more of this or how data security works, or some of the other elements that we bring to the picture here, you can contact us at HITRUST, that's HYTRUST.com, and we'd be happy to let you know more about how all these systems fit together or other ways that you can apply this kind of technology. So I know that we wanted to make sure that we had plenty of time for questions, so I'm going to hand it back to Diane and Brandon, and I'd be happy to talk further.
Great. Thank you. Thanks to both of you. Just want to remind everyone that to go ahead and submit as many questions as you want. We might not get to all of them in the next few minutes, but I'm certain that both of our presenters today will be happy to follow up offline to address anything that you'd like to have them answer. Question for Bill. There's a lot of talk about GDPR, and it is a European law. Can you elaborate on the relevance for a company that only has operations in the United States?
Sure. Yeah, you can kind of think of that in two categories. One category is a U.S.-based company that if they have any operations in the EU or customers in the EU or employees and so on, then obviously this is front and center, because even if most of their operation is in the U.S., if they run afoul of GDPR, and one of the critical things about GDPR is you don't have to have a loss of data to result in a case. You just have to have a resident or a EU citizen or an organization say that, hey, I'm concerned about how they're handling my data. I want to bring a case. And if the EU in the member states of the EU, if those authorities say that we're going to bring a case, then they can bring a case. Now, in one case, that's where I've got customers and sort of vested interest in Europe. Okay, that makes sense, right? Because if there's a legal issue, then that can have legal, financial, and other implications for you because you're over there. Alternatively, there's a company that is entirely, all their customers, everything is within the United States. They may think, well, gee, I really don't need to worry about this. But I would argue that that's probably a bit short-sighted, because what we see happening is a couple things. One is that there's an increasing push to adopt GDPR-like data privacy standards, and this is no surprise really when you consider the kinds of breaches and really egregious data breaches that we've seen lately, is that, that legislation is inching its way in that direction. The other is that there is some precedence for the EU authorities to be able to bring cases back in the United States. And so, and through the, I'm blanking on it right now, but basically there's some legal framework that is take shape that allows some of that to happen. Now, I think what you'll see is starting in May 25th, when this goes into effect, you're going to see a bunch of trial cases. And more than likely, those big cases are going to involve very large organizations like a Facebook or something. But you will definitely see that this sort of legal framework is happening. And I think probably within a certain number of years, you're going to see that this is going to be a global phenomenon anyway.
Interesting. Thank you. Question for Brandon. Can the Pivot 3 solution be managed by an enterprise's own IT department using their normal system management tools?
Yes. Yeah, that's a good question. So our solutions, the Pivot 3 solutions now, can be managed in two ways. One is we offer our own management application called vStack Manager. It's a very simple, very lightweight application that makes it pretty easy that a number of our end users deploy. But more and more, we're finding that as the IT departments take over ownership and administration of the infrastructure, that they prefer to leverage their own management tools. And so because in the virtualization world, we're based on the VMware virtualization technology, we have a plug-in now to the VMware vCenter management tool that's used in the vSphere suite. So if most IT departments are pretty familiar with that, if they use VMware, and if they have that, they can manage not only the virtual machines in the system, but they can actually manage the Pivot 3 storage as well. So it's a very nice and elegant way of managing using the tools that they're familiar with.
Okay. One question came in about the encryption keys. I'm thinking the encryption keys with the Pivot 3 system go past 256 bits.
Yes. So these are typically sort of industry standard and highly secure encryption is 256-bit encryption keys, and certainly in HITRUST that's what we use. And we're using this in a lot of things like U.S. Department of Defense, different governments, U.S. intelligence community. So we go through a process also that's called FIPS 140-2, which means that an independent lab that's certified validates that we're doing crypto in the right way, essentially. So, so absolutely, 256-bit.
Okay. And Bill, as well, regarding encryption, this question is, what if someone gets a key or a copy of a key? What if someone gives away a copy of the key? Could they then get to the video data?
Sure. So that's a good question, and because it's a little bit counterintuitive, if you think of an encryption key kind of like a password, then that would be the case. But the good news is that that's not what we do, and in fact, what you don't want to do, and that is you really, like in our system, the encryption keys are generated and they are protected. The encryption keys themselves are actually wrapped by other keys, meaning that they themselves are also encrypted, and that those keys, so it's kind of like peeling the onion affair, those keys are actually protected through, without going into the details, where we do splitting of these multiple keys across and available to administrators and so on. So no one individual could get access to keys. And in fact, we never expose a data encryption key. We never expose a data encryption key to anyone. So no human being, no administrator actually ever handles or sees or gets their hands on an encryption key. So that way, obviously, you make it so that, you know, even if somebody decided they wanted to give it away, you really have no vehicle to do that. Okay.
I want to ask a question for Brandon about the Pivot 3 software. Does that require custom integrations to hardware and VMS solutions?
No, it does not. Well, let me qualify that a little bit. So there's no engineering technical integration required between the Pivot 3 software and any VMS or any other application software for that matter. So as long as the VMS will run on an x86 platform in a virtualized environment, which virtually most of them, or virtually all of them, I should say, do. In fact, we There was a time when some of them wouldn't run virtualized, and we worked with their engineering departments to ensure that they would kind of come up to speed there, and they have. As far as the hardware, there's no technical customization or any kind of custom hardware requirements, but we do have specific builds and configurations of the hardware that are required, but there's nothing custom or really special about it.
Okay. Both Pivot 3 and HITRUST are going to be at ISC West next month. Is that correct? Or will you be there?
Yes, we will. Yes, we will be at ISC West. We'll have actually a great, nice-sized booth this year in a great location. And in fact, HITRUST is going to join us there in our booth at Pivot 3 West. At ISC West. So we're excited about that.
We're looking forward to it.
Okay. Good. Then I think I think we have time just for one last question. And to Brandon, what's the difference between the Pivot 3 failover and the failover provided by the VMS software?
Okay. Good question. I see you saw must have on the slide that we have failover capability.
Yeah.
So we do have failover capability. That's one of the ways that we deliver that high level of resiliency. What that means is we fail over a VM in the event that a node or hardware fails. And it's often used as a replacement for VMS software failover, or it can be used in conjunction with software failover. The primary difference, though, or differences, I should say, is one is in the event of a software failover with VMS, you typically lose access to your previously recorded video. Typically move over. With Pivot 3 failover, you ensure that all of your previously recorded video is accessible even during the failure. And secondly, we can, with the Pivot 3 failover, we provide failover capability actually to the entire suite of software. So not just the VMS, but any other software like access control or PSIM or analytics or whatever happens to be running on that platform will fail over everything. And I think the last one that differentiates it a bit is there's no additional cost or no additional licenses required with Pivot 3 software. It's a base part of our platform. It comes with every solution that we sell, and there's no additional licensing or cost required. So it's a very cost-effective solution. Okay.
Great. Well, that's all the time we have for today for questions. I wanted to say thank you very much to Brandon Reich and Bill Hackenberger for your presentation, as well as our sponsor today, Pivot 3. And if you have any additional questions or comments, you still have a couple seconds here to submit them. As I said, I know both presenters would be happy to address them offline. As you exit today, if you wouldn't take just a couple minutes to go ahead and complete our survey, we look at those comments and we tweak things as necessary. We appreciate your feedback. So thank you, everyone, for your time, and enjoy the rest of your day.